Something has changed in the sky, and it changed sooner than almost anyone in the forecasting world was ready for. Just a few nights ago, the big computer models that meteorologists across this country rely on were showing a stubborn, sticky, unmoving stretch of late summer heat with no real end in sight. Then, almost overnight, those same models woke up and painted a completely different picture. A massive pattern is now assembling itself across the top of the globe, a pattern so wide that it stretches from the coastline of Alaska all the way over to the icy edge of Greenland, and it is about to reach down and take hold of the middle of the United States. If you have spent the last several weeks tossing and turning through nights that never seem to cool off, if you have been standing in front of your thermostat wondering when this heat is finally going to let go, I want you to stick with me, because the answer is coming, faster than most people realize, and it is bigger than a lot of forecasters expected even a week ago. Before we get into it, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because over the next stretch of this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what is coming when it arrives in your part of the country, and there's one twist buried in the middle of this setup that almost nobody is talking about yet. By the time we're done here, you are going to understand this pattern on a deeper level than anything you'd get from a quick headline. Let's start with what matters most to you, and then I'll pull back the curtain and show you the actual machinery driving all of this, because understanding the why is what separates a real forecast from a guess. High up in the atmosphere, in the layer where the jet stream races around the planet like a fast-moving river of wind, a blocking pattern is taking shape. That term, blocking, is about as literal as weather terminology gets. Under normal conditions, the jet stream moves in a fairly straight line from west to east, and it drags storm systems along behind it, one after another, in a rhythm that keeps our day-to-day weather changing at a predictable pace. But every so often, something enormous plants itself directly in that river of wind and simply refuses to move. A dome of high pressure builds and just sits there like a boulder dropped into a fast-flowing stream. The air can't push straight through it anymore, so instead it has to bend around it, and when it bends, it doesn't bend gently. It buckles into huge, sweeping loops, and inside those loops, cold air that is normally locked up in the Arctic suddenly finds a door left wide open to the south. Right now, we are not looking at one of these blocking domes forming. We are looking at two of them building at the same time, and that is exactly what makes this setup so unusual and so worth paying attention to. Here is where I want to get specific, because I don't want to just tell you a big pattern is coming without showing you the receipts. Forecasters lean on a handful of specific atmospheric measurements to know when a shift like this is on the way, and right now, several of those measurements are all flashing the same warning light at the same time. The first one is called the North Atlantic Oscillation. Don't let the name intimidate you. All it really measures is the pressure difference over the northern Atlantic, especially in the area around Greenland. When that number swings into negative territory, it's a signal that high pressure is stacking up over Greenland, and that's the first of our two boulders. The newest data has that number diving negative right around the 24th of the month, and staying negative potentially all the way into the opening days of September. That is not a minor wobble. That's a sustained shift, and it is exactly the kind of pattern that steers cold air toward the eastern half of the country. The second measurement is called the East Pacific Oscillation, and this one governs the weather happening up near Alaska. When it swings negative, a ridge of high pressure balloons up over Alaska and the northeastern Pacific Ocean. That's our second boulder. And here is the part that genuinely made forecasters do a double take when they saw it. Both of these signals are turning negative at nearly the exact same time, in the exact same window, and they are reinforcing each other rather than working independently. A negative reading up near Alaska builds a wall of high pressure on the western side of the continent. A negative reading near Greenland builds a wall of high pressure on the eastern side. When you put a wall of high pressure on both ends of the country at once, the cold air trapped in that buckled jet stream in the middle has nowhere left to go except straight down, right into the heart of North America. Now, I want to be honest with you here, the same way I try to be honest in every one of these breakdowns, because there is a real meaningful disagreement happening between the forecast models right now, and it actually matters for how this plays out. The two heavyweight systems that meteorologists lean on the most are the American model and the European model. Think of them as two extremely experienced navigators looking at the exact same storm system on the horizon. Most of the time, these two agree on the big picture, and in this case, they do agree that a block is forming and that cooler air is heading south. Where they disagree is on how strong that block ultimately gets and how far south the cold air actually reaches. The American model is leaning toward a deeper, more aggressive block, one that would send noticeably colder air plunging much farther down the map than a typical late August pattern. The European model sees the same overall shift developing, but it keeps things a bit more restrained, calling for cooler conditions up north without the same dramatic southward push. That gap between the two models is the single biggest source of uncertainty in this entire forecast, and I'll be coming back to it. because how that disagreement eventually resolves is going to decide whether the Deep South gets any meaningful relief at all in the coming weeks. There's a third piece to this story, and it's really the engine sitting underneath everything else we've talked about so far. Out in the Pacific Ocean, El Nino is strengthening, and it's strengthening quickly. The Climate Prediction Center currently puts the odds at greater than 90% that this becomes a very strong event as we move into fall and winter. That is a significant development, and here is why it ties directly into what's happening in the sky above you right now. El Nino works by warming an enormous stretch of the tropical Pacific Ocean. When that ocean warms up, it shifts where thunderstorm activity fires off near the equator, and that shift, in turn, nudges the entire jet stream into a new configuration thousands of miles away. It's one of the clearest, most well-documented examples in all of atmospheric science of how the ocean and the sky are wired together across huge distances. The warming Pacific is helping tilt the odds toward exactly the kind of buckled, blocky jet stream pattern we're watching come together right now. So this isn't random noise or fluke in the models. There's an actual driver behind it, and that driver is only getting stronger as we go. Let me walk you through how this actually plays out day by day, because the timing on this one really matters. For the rest of this week, you're already going to feel the first hints of change moving through. A cooler push of air is sliding across parts of the country, and it's real. It's not imagined. But here's the catch that trips a lot of people up when they see that first cool shot. This is not the main event. It's a preview. Every single day, right behind that first cool push, the heat tries to rebuild itself. You might wake up to a genuinely pleasant, crisp morning, and then watch the temperature climb right back up by the afternoon. Across the northern tier of the country, highs are settling into the 70s, where you'd previously been baking in the 90s, which is a real and welcome break, but it's not permanent yet. The full pattern hasn't locked into place. Think of it like a wave pulling back out to sea just before it finally breaks on shore. The real turning point, the one this entire forecast is built around, arrives as we push toward the 25th and 26th. That's the window when the block fully matures, when high pressure firmly anchors itself up near Alaska and up near Greenland, and the jet stream carves its deepest dip yet down into the middle of the country. When that happens, a substantial cold front comes barreling south, and this one is not a preview. This is the wave, actually breaking. For the Midwest, the Great Lakes region, the Ohio Valley, and the Northeast, we're talking about temperatures running 10 to 15 degrees below average, and in the coldest pockets of air, potentially as much as 20 degrees below where they should be. Just sit with that number for a second. 20 degrees below normal in the final days of August is the kind of anomaly that has people digging out a jacket they thought was put away for the season. Overnight lows in the chilliest spots could tumble down into the 50s. And if the American model's deeper, more aggressive solution ends up verifying, some locations could even flirt with the 40s. That's a genuine taste of early autumn showing up while the calendar still technically says summer. I want to hear from you on this one, so drop a comment and tell me your city or your region, along with one simple thing. Are you the person who is thrilled about this cold front finally arriving? Or are you the person who isn't ready to say goodbye to summer just yet? I read through these every time, and the split is always fascinating because this exact same pattern is a rescue for some of you and a genuine disappointment for others, depending entirely on where you live. Now here's the twist I promised you at the very start of this video, the piece that most people watching the news are going to completely miss. While all of that cool air is flooding into the north and east, that same exact pattern is doing something almost the opposite to the southern half of the country. Remember, when you build a massive block and force the jet stream to buckle, you don't just get a cold trough on one side. On the other side of that buckle, you get a ridge, a dome of heat, and this particular pattern is shoving that heat dome directly over the west and the south central states. So at the very moment folks up in the upper Midwest are pulling sweatshirts out of storage, folks across Texas, Oklahoma, the Deep South, and the Desert Southwest are going to be dealing with relentless, dangerous heat. This isn't a small side note buried in the forecast. The Climate Prediction Center has actually issued a specific warning message about extreme heat and rapid onset drought building across the southern United States. That means the ground is going to dry out fast. The heat is going to start feeding on itself. And this becomes a genuine hazard, not just an uncomfortable stretch of weather. Picture the map for a second like a giant seesaw. When you press down hard on one end, the other end shoots straight up. That is essentially what's happening across the continent right now. The same atmospheric setup that's about to deliver real relief to the northern half of the country is simultaneously locking a lid of heat over the southern half. In the hottest zones across the desert southwest, we're still talking about afternoon highs punching past 110, even 115 degrees. Across the south central states and the southeast, widespread readings above 100 degrees are on the table, and once you factor in humidity and calculate the heat index, the number that actually reflects what it feels like on your skin, those values climb even higher. The drought risk makes everything worse too, because dry soil doesn't cool itself the way moist ground does. Every scorching day bakes the land a little harder, and that baked land then radiates even more heat back up into the atmosphere the following day. It's a feedback loop, and once one of these gets rolling, it's genuinely hard to break. That divide, refreshing and cool up north, dangerous and blistering down south, is really the heart of this entire story. It's a tale of two different Americas separated by a single line drawn across the weather map, and where you happen to live relative to that line decides almost everything about your next couple of weeks. The farther that block manages to push the cold front south, the more of the country escapes the grip of this heat. If the American model turns out to be right, and the block goes especially deep, that front could theoretically push all the way toward the Gulf Coast as we move into September, which would be a genuine shock to the system for places that haven't felt a below-average temperature reading in what feels like forever. But if the European model turns out to be closer to reality and the block stays more contained, then the relief mostly stops short, and the South stays locked underneath that heat dome for a longer stretch. This is exactly why I keep coming back to the disagreement between these two models. It isn't some minor technical detail buried in the data. It's the whole ballgame for tens of millions of people trying to plan the next couple of weeks of their lives. Let me pull back from the big picture pattern for a moment and talk about what's happening right now in the near term, because a shift like this one doesn't arrive quietly. When cold air on the move starts colliding with warm, humid air that has been parked in place for weeks, the atmosphere reacts, and that reaction shows up as storms. Over the past couple of days, that clash has already produced rounds of rough weather, and the Storm Prediction Center is flagging even more of it as this front continues pushing through. The good news, and I want to be calm and clear about this rather than blow it out of proportion, is that this is not shaping up to be a major tornado situation. The primary threats coming out of these storms are damaging wind and large hail, and I want to walk you through exactly why that is. Because understanding the reasoning behind a forecast keeps you safer than simply reacting to a warning without context. For the middle of this week, forecasters have outlined what's called a slight risk of severe storms stretching across the Central Plains, the lower Missouri Valley, and the upper Midwest. In plain language, that means scattered strong storms are likely, and some of those storms are going to cross the threshold into truly severe territory. The setup here involves something called steep lapse rates, which is just a technical way of describing how quickly the air cools off as you climb higher into the atmosphere. That kind of temperature profile acts like a ramp for rising air, letting thunderstorms build tall and powerful in a hurry. Layer on top of that, a boost of wind higher up in the atmosphere, generated by an overnight low-level jet that strengthens after dark, and you end up with storms capable of organizing into clusters that produce damaging wind gusts as they race across the landscape. The Storm Prediction Center has specifically highlighted the potential for gusts strong enough to snap tree branches, knock down power lines, and cause the kind of scattered outages that can leave neighborhoods without power for hours at a time. There's also a real hail threat riding along with these storms, with some cells capable of producing stones large enough to dent vehicles and damage roofing, with a few of the most intense storms potentially producing hail exceeding 2 inches in diameter. Geographically, keep an eye on the northern Rockies and the central high plains, where a small ripple of energy in the upper atmosphere, what meteorologists call a shortwave, dives southeast and helps ignite storms. Watch the upper Midwest, too, across parts of Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where storms are expected to fire out ahead of the advancing front and may begin as isolated, rotating supercells, capable of producing large hail before eventually collapsing into a line and shifting into more of a straight-line wind threat by evening. Keep an eye on the Central Plains and the lower Missouri Valley as well, where storms are expected to cluster together and grow into a larger, organized system carrying a real damaging wind threat as it sweeps toward Missouri. Down across Mississippi, Alabama, and into northern Florida, a very moist and unstable air mass is going to support additional storm development, although the wind shear in that region is weaker, so those storms tend to fall into more of a pulse and collapse category, the kind that still packs a real punch through sudden intense downbursts even without much organization. Looking one additional day ahead, the severe weather threat shifts and reorganizes around the Ozark Plateau and into the Mid-South, with 1 or 2 clusters of storms capable of producing swaths of damaging wind. There's even a mention of central and southeastern Arizona getting drawn into the action as monsoon moisture interacts with the terrain out there. The tornado risk across these days remains low, generally sitting in that 2% range, which forecasters classify as a marginal isolated concern rather than anything widespread. If a brief tornado does spin up, it would most likely be quick and short-lived rather than one of the long-track systems you tend to see during the peak of spring. Then, moving toward Thursday, the main action shifts into the northern plains, covering Minnesota, Nebraska, and northern Kansas, with large hail becoming the headline threat thanks to that same combination of strong wind shear, steep lapse rates, and just enough available moisture. A separate, smaller threat for locally damaging gusts sets up from eastern Virginia into the Carolinas as a wave crosses over the Appalachians. I want to give you something practical here, because a forecast is only genuinely useful if it changes what you actually do. When storms like these move through your area, the single most important thing you can have is a reliable way to receive warnings, even while you're asleep. A weather radio, or simply the alert system built into your phone, can wake you up the moment a warning is issued for your exact location. Damaging wind and large hail don't require an actual tornado to be dangerous. A 70-mile-per-hour gust can bring a large tree down onto a house just as easily as a tornado could, and it can knock out power for an entire town just as effectively. So take these threats seriously. Bring in anything loose sitting in your yard. Park your vehicle under cover if that's an option for you, and know ahead of time where the sturdiest interior room in your home is. Now let me tie these storms back into the larger pattern, because they aren't a separate story happening off to the side. They are, in a very real sense, the sound of the pattern actually changing. Every one of these fronts represents a boundary between the old air mass and the new one, between the summer that is fighting to hang on and the cooler regime that's trying to take its place. As the block matures over the coming week, an upper-level ridge is forecast to expand from the Four Corners region into the southern plains, while the flow aloft over the northern plains bends and shifts eastward across the Midwest and into the Northeast. That's the signature of this entire pattern coming together. The storms we're seeing this week are essentially the friction generated by that transition. Once the block fully locks into place and the big cool anomaly settles in over the northern and eastern states toward the end of the month, the atmosphere in those regions calms down because the sharp temperature contrast that fuels storm activity moves south along with the front. Let me talk about the tropics for a moment too, because you may have already heard some chatter about a system out in the Atlantic, and I want to give you the honest, grounded read on it rather than the sensationalized version. There is the possibility of a tropical wave rolling off the African coast and attempting to develop out in the Atlantic. But the odds of that wave becoming something significant enough to threaten land are low right now, and here's the genuinely interesting part. The very same pattern we've spent this entire video discussing is a big part of the reason why. Remember that strengthening El Nino we talked about earlier. One of the things a strong El Nino reliably does is crank up wind shear across the Atlantic basin. Wind shear happens when winds are blowing at different speeds and different directions at different heights in the atmosphere, and it is absolutely brutal for a young, developing tropical system. It rips a storm apart before it has a chance to properly organize, tilting and shredding the tall thunderstorms that a hurricane needs in order to survive and strengthen. On top of that, if the block manages to send a cold front pushing far enough out over the ocean, it can inject dry, stable air, along with even more shear directly into the path of any wave that's trying to spin up, effectively pushing it away and keeping it weak. So while the tropics are never something to completely tune out during hurricane season, the atmospheric deck is currently stacked against any major development, and that's a direct consequence of the exact same forces reshaping your local forecast right now. Here's something I genuinely love your take on down in the comments. When two of the world's best forecast models disagree the way the American and European models are disagreeing right now, which one do you find yourself trusting more and why? Some of you follow this stuff closely and already have your own opinion on which model has been performing better lately. Others just want the bottom line without diving into the technical back and forth. Tell me how you personally handle a forecast when the experts themselves are split on the outcome, because that tension between certainty and honesty is really at the heart of what makes this whole field so difficult and so genuinely interesting. Let me get concrete now about the actual temperatures you can expect, because this is likely what most of you came here for. Highs across the central and northern parts of the country settle into the 70s and 80s, which for a lot of you represents a very welcome step down from where things have been. But push farther into the central and southern states, and you're still looking at readings above 100 degrees, with the southeast sitting in the high 90s to around 100, and the desert southwest still cooking in the range of 110 to 115. And remember, those numbers represent raw air temperature. The heat index, the number that tells you what it actually feels like once humidity gets factored in, runs even higher than that, which is exactly why the Climate Prediction Center is treating this extreme heat as a genuine hazard rather than just an inconvenience. As the days go by, each cold front that pushes through knocks the northern temperatures down another notch, but the heat keeps trying to rebuild itself right behind it. So it becomes a rhythm. Cool, then warm again, cool, then warm again, right up until the big block finally slams the door shut on that cycle. That final decisive moment, the deepest cool shot of the whole pattern, is really the payoff of this entire forecast. And it lands as we cross from next Tuesday and Wednesday into the final days of the month. That's when the coolest air of the whole event arrives, noticeably deeper and colder than the smaller previews we've seen earlier in the week, with the Midwest, Great Lakes, and northeast, potentially running 10 to 20 degrees below average. Overnight lows slide into the 50s, and in the most extreme scenarios, into the 40s in a handful of spots. When forecasters line up the shorter range models against the longer range climate guidance, there's agreement that cooler air is on the way, although the longer range guidance is a touch less aggressive about exactly how deep that cold dives. That's the same American versus European tension resurfacing in a slightly different form. The overall trend, though, the direction everything is leaning, favors the colder outcome for the northern tier, and possibly a push of that cooler air farther south than we've seen in quite a while, assuming the stronger version of the block ends up verifying. So where does everybody actually land once the dust settles? A large portion of the northern and central country ends up comfortably in the 50s and 60s for overnight lows, with pleasant daytime conditions that finally feel like the turn of the season. The zone that had been stuck in the 90s drops down into the 70s. The zone that had been baking in triple digits may ease into the 80s, but the far south and the desert southwest, sitting directly underneath that ridge, stay hot, and if any relief reaches them at all, it arrives late and it arrives modest. Then, as we move into the first third of September, the guidance hints that the cold front could push even deeper, which would extend and expand that relief even further. That's the more optimistic branch of this forecast, and I'll be watching it closely. Because if it holds up, it means a genuine, lasting break for a much larger share of the country than we're currently expecting. Let me pull all of this together into one clear picture, because I promised you at the beginning that you'd walk away understanding this better than the headlines. Here's the whole thing in a single breath. A rare double block is forming, one dome of high pressure anchoring near Alaska and another anchoring near Greenland, both nudged into place in part by a rapidly strengthening El Nino out in the Pacific. That double block buckles the jet stream, carving a deep trough down through the middle of the country that floods the north and east with unusually cool air for late August, while at the same time building a heat ridge that traps dangerous, drought-feeding heat over the south and the desert southwest. The clash between the incoming cool air and the lingering summer warmth fires off rounds of storms, mostly wind and hail-driven rather than tornado-driven, as the whole pattern rearranges itself. And the single biggest question still hanging over this forecast is how far south that cold front ultimately manages to push, a question the American and European models are actively disagreeing about right now, with the deeper, more dramatic solution favored by the American model and the more restrained solution held by the European model. The reason I'm confident telling you that relief is genuinely on the way is that the driving signals, the negative North Atlantic oscillation, the negative East Pacific oscillation, and the strengthening El Nino are all pointing in the same direction at the same time. And that kind of agreement across multiple independent signals is what gives a forecast real backbone. The reason I'm not going to pretend I know the exact temperature that's going to show up in your backyard on the last day of the month is that the depth of this block is still being worked out. And this is weather, which means it's going to wobble and shift a little between now and then. What I can promise you is that I'll keep tracking every new run of these models, every update to those key signals, and I'll tell you the truth as it evolves. Whether that truth ends up being the cold plunging farther than we hoped, or the block backing off sooner than we wanted. If you've made it this far, you now understand a pattern that's about to define the next 2 weeks of weather for tens of millions of people, and you understand it not as a headline, but as an actual machine, with gears turning all the way from the Pacific Ocean up to the top of Greenland, down to the front porch outside your own door. That's really the whole point of this channel, not to scare you, not to hype you up unnecessarily, but to hand you the real picture so you can plan your life, protect your family, and actually understand what's coming and why it's coming. The heat that has felt like it would never let go is finally meeting its match, and the door to autumn is cracking open earlier than expected across a big stretch of this country. So here's what I'm asking. If this helped make the forecast clearer for you, hit that like button, because it genuinely helps more people discover honest weather coverage instead of clickbait. Share this with someone you know who has been miserable in the heat, because relief is on the way, and they deserve to hear about it. And if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications, because this pattern is moving fast, the models are updating constantly, and I'll be here breaking down every twist the moment it happens. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you're ready for the cool down or dreading it. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe, keep an eye on the sky when those storms roll through, and remember, the atmosphere just made its move.